Mohammad Eslami is a research fellow in Middle East and North African Studies at Tehran University. He's joining us live from the Iranian capital. And Samir Puri is a visiting lecturer in war studies at King's College in London. He is in Singapore. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera. Samir, I want to ask you first of all, what do you think that the US is trying to achieve by blocking these ships in and out of Iranian ports?
I think what it's trying to achieve can be very simply summarized as coercion of the Iranian government. That's always been the goal for the US ever since regime change or regime collapse ceased being possible. But coercion means forcibly changing the Iranian government's behavior and policies on all the issues of contention. And what that means with the blockade is it means restricting, probably most critically, Iran's ability to export oil and receive imports by controlling its ports, which is going to hit the jugular of the Iranian economy.
Now, Mohammed, Iran's Revolutionary Guard says that Gulf ports should be for everyone or no one. So if the US does block ships going to and from Iranian ports, how do you think Iran is going to respond?
First of all, I should say that it is a matter of question if the U.S. Army can can blockade the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, because it's a vast, very, very big. Where the VLGCs, the tankers, super tankers are going. It's a hard operation for the U.S. Army. However, from the Iranian, it's a challenge for them because they are right now on their very, very pressure in terms of military and also economic pressures on the President Pezeshkian administration. So they don't want the Americans to stop this entrance for food and other things that they need while they are under a war by the Israelis and the Americans. So they want to send a very strong message to the Americans while they are thinking about, both parties are thinking about somehow diplomatic settlements for the crisis, but they don't want this strait to be closed. And this is very, very big, step by both sides.
Mohammed, in the event that the IRGC decided that it was going to take action against ports on the other side of the Gulf, because that is something that it has hinted in its latest statement, how much is it prepared to risk the relationships, or what remains of the relationships that it has with the other Gulf nations?
I think we should talk about some specific ports. If you are speaking about some specific ports in UAE, it was as the consequences of the UAE government involvement in the attacks against Iran. I think that the Iranian army and the IRGC are waiting for a chance to attack the UAE ports in an action against what happened in the last hours before the ceasefire.
Samir, in terms of the kind of options that are available to the US military when it comes to this blockade, one would imagine that and we've seen evidence of this over the last 2 or 3 weeks, if you fire at a tanker which is laden with oil, the risks of an environmental catastrophe are huge. So in your estimation, what actions can the US military take in order to be able to exert some sort of control over the shipping in the Strait?
So these are the sorts of questions that are going to become really vital over the next few days and weeks, is how the US actually goes about enforcing this kind of blockade. And of course, we don't know exactly how the US will approach it. We do know that they have the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea. They've got, I believe, 8 guided missile cruisers also in the region, which means they can defend against Iranian air attacks. And the US may try to impose some kind of inspection mechanism of its own, possibly on the entry to the Gulf of Oman. Who knows exactly where they'll set that physical perimeter. But that inspection regime might really be designed to kind of guide and direct the behavior and sort of directions of travel of the various super tankers entering and exiting this region, and probably to try to identify these so-called shadow fleet vessels that Iran has relied upon to export a lot of its oil. But I think having those watchful eyes focused on the entry and exit of tankers into this maritime space might actually start to achieve something for the US. But let's not underestimate how complex this is, because the US military will have to do this potentially under fire if Iran is able to retaliate.
Samir, I also want to ask you about a couple of statements that we've just had in the last 2 or 3 hours. One from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, saying that the UK is not going to get dragged into the Iran war. It's whatever pressure it feels that it's being put under, but it will be part, or is willing to be part, of any sort of monitoring process if there's a ceasefire. French President Emmanuel Macron apparently talking about pulling together some sort of defensive coalition to open the Strait of Hormuz. In your estimation, what would have to be in place for that to work?
It's really important to remember this is not just happening in a vacuum involving the US and Iran. Respectively, the British and the French governments have been quite active in the last few weeks, conducting some preparatory diplomacy around their possible leadership roles in maritime security coalitions. But I think the answer to your question is very simple. The French Navy and the British Navy probably aren't going to sail into a war zone. There would need to be some clear sense that the conflict had entered a post-conflict phase where the shooting had stopped, and that maritime security, sea mine clearance and other sort of assurance voyages that British and French and other European warships might undertake would not actually invite Iranian retaliatory fire. So I think those are the broad preconditions, but I think the fact that the European governments you've mentioned are engaged is important.
Mohammad, this is all, of course, coming off the back of the failure of the talks in Islamabad just over the weekend. In your estimation, how far away are we from the possibility of those talks restarting or in some way being continued compared to where we were prior to the meeting in Islamabad?
First of all, I should say that it was not a normal negotiation. It was a kind of very, very hard conversation under the circumstances of war between two countries. So, by the way, two parties were very, very close to a kind of diplomatic settlement. They were very close. But however, by the act of the Israelis and sabotaging they have sabotaged the deal, and they pressured on American delegation not to accept what they have already accepted before the Islamabad negotiations. So right now, I think that the Pakistani government, along with some other countries, we can name Saudi Arabia, we can name Turkey, and some other European countries, they are trying to survive the peace talks between Iran and United States. But the question is about what happened for the US and Iran to think about the ceasefire. The realities on the ground for both sides were, in a way, to think about the ceasefire and thinking about the diplomatic settlement. I think even after these act of somehow violation by the U.S. Administration, the realities remain the same. I think it is a possibility for both sides to think more about diplomatic solutions.
Mohammad Eslami, Research Fellow in Middle East and North Africa Studies, Tehran University, and Samir Puri, Visiting Lecturer in War Studies at King's College London from Singapore. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera.